Hi, my name is Amy Rutledge, and I will be presenting on Malcolm Knowles and andragogy. We will be looking at biographical information of Knowles, a brief history of andragogy, Knowles' assumptions of adult learners, primary criticisms of his theory, and the personal impact of this research on my own learning philosophy. Biographical information. Knowles was born in 1913 in Montana. Even as a young teenager, strong humanistic tendencies became apparent, as he would encourage those around him to succeed in addition to his own success. While attending Harvard University, Malcolm Knowles worked for Phillips Brooks House, a charitable organization that worked with troubled young men. Knowles was able to influence and guide several young men there, and as a result of his guidance, all but one of them graduated high school. This became a significant event in Knowles' life and impacted his later learning philosophies. Knowles moved on from Harvard and began working for the YMCA, eventually moving to Chicago, where he worked for the Central YMCA College in Chicago. He also attended the University of Chicago, where he earned his master's and PhD. Following this, he began teaching as a full-time professor of adult education at Boston University. He then moved on to teach at North Carolina State University as a professor of adult and community college education, and eventually retired from education in 1979. Although he retired, he continued working in adult education, where he wrote 18 books and over 200 articles. He also continued to work as a part-time adjunct professor in education and an independent consultant for human resource development. Malcolm Knowles died on Thanksgiving Day in 1997. The history of andragogy. The word andragogy, as we know it, was first introduced to us by Alexander Kapp in 1833. Kapp was a German gym teacher, and he used the term to refer specifically to the teaching of men, not women. He emphasized in his book that adults can learn through personal experience and self-reflection. This results in and indicates that adults can therefore be lifelong learners, and that learning can take place outside of the traditional pedagogical classrooms. The idea of andragogy did not resurface until the early 1920s with the German workers' education movement. Edward Lindemann traveled to Germany, where he was introduced to the term andragogy and brought that term back to the United States. Lindemann's views of andragogy varied from those of European, and he saw it more as an informal method of teaching adults, and doing this through experiential learning and discussion. Lindemann saw adults as being autonomous learners, responsible for their own learning, and encouraged democracy within the classroom. In the late 1950s, Dusan Savicevic, a professor at the University of Belgrade, rose to fame in Europe within the educational realm as being an expert in andragogy. He studied the effectiveness of andragogy in 10 European countries, and he introduced the term to Malcolm Knowles in 1966 while attending one of Knowles' graduate courses. Following the course, he approached Knowles and let him know that he was practicing andragogy. This would be the first time that Malcolm Knowles heard the word, and he latched onto it because all of a sudden now he had a term that kind of enveloped that which he had already begun researching in regards to adult education. Malcolm Knowles published his book, The Modern Practice of Adult Education, in 1970 and introduced his theory to the world. He was almost immediately confronted by critics because his theory was so controversial and in contrast to traditional pedagogical learning. Despite the confrontation, Malcolm Knowles continued to challenge adult educators to change their views on adult education, and his theory eventually became the foundation of American andragogy. Knowles' andragogy. Knowles developed 4 assumptions of adult learners and eventually added a 5th. His first assumption is that of self-concept, that as humans mature from children to adults, our self-concept changes from that of being dependent to independent, self-directed learners. The second assumption is that of experience. Adults acquire a plethora of experiences through which we can learn. As a result, he encouraged educators to find ways to incorporate those experiences into learning activities. His third assumption is readiness to learn. Adult learners are ready to learn that which is applicable to their current state in life. His fourth assumption is orientation to learn. Adults want to learn things that they can immediately apply to their life. This means that they're not focused on learning so much subject as problem solving. And eventually he added his fifth assumption that adults are intrinsically motivated to learn. Those external motivators tend to fall aside, and our internal motivation is what pushes us to learn. Knowles developed a 7-step process to help in the facilitation of andragogical activities within a classroom. So the first step in this process is to establish a positive learning environment. Then the learners participate in planning their learning activities. Next, the educator should facilitate the diagnosis of learners' needs. Then they will set learning objectives based upon those needs. Next, the learners will help in developing learning activities. They will also help in the conduction of those learning activities. And finally, the learners evaluate their progress. This puts all of the responsibility for learning onto the adult learner and sets the teacher into a position as a facilitator of learning, completely opposite of your traditional pedagogical classroom. Primary criticisms. The biggest criticism of andragogy is this lack of empirical evidence. The gathering of empirical evidence is a scientific process that includes observation, induction, deduction, testing, and evaluation. The nature of andragogy does not tend to lend itself to scientific study. There's an inability to measure its effectiveness because Knowles was a big advocate for moving away from standardized tests and traditional grading. Without that, there's no way to effectively measure in a scientific manner the effectiveness of andragogy. Another big issue is the meaning of the terminology varies by user. In science, you cannot have that many variables in an equation. And so the nature of andragogy just leads to evidence being anecdotal and not empirical. The other major criticism is the disconnect between the student and society. Many critics say that Knowles did not take into consideration societal impacts on adult learners, impacts such as race, gender, and socioeconomic status. As a result, they say that andragogy lacks inclusivity. Interestingly, Knowles acknowledged that adult education leads to increased inequality, and he actually pushed for federal funding to help bring practical adult education to underrepresented groups. So he was aware of that, despite the criticism. The personal impact of this, how this project impacted my personal learning philosophy. There's 3 key areas that were impacted through my research. One is the simple reminding of the importance of connecting the past to the present. So many times I become focused on the present learning that I forget to look back to the past. And so it was refreshing to go through the history of andragogy back to the beginnings and walk my way through that. And then the second thing is, in doing that, I realized that it helps in predicting future trends. By connecting the past to the present, we can then look forward to the future and start to see how is this going to change the future of adult education. And third, this project helped me pinpoint areas that need further research, both in my own personal learning, but also within my field of work. As an adult educator, I can see that we need to continue to research andragogy within our classrooms. We need to find a way to gather empirical evidence to limit the variables in practice. And so this is something that I'll be thinking about here in the future as I continue with my studies with Southeastern. That is all I have for this presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. And thank you very much for your time and attention.